The humble beginning. Far beyond the familiar stars of the Milky Way, where ancient civilizations thrived and galactic powers stretched across the void, a new player had emerged. Humanity, once a small and isolated species, had now begun to claim its place among the stars. But despite their rapid technological advances, humans were still regarded with skepticism and mockery by the greater galactic community. It was in the towering crystalline halls of the Galactic Council that this tension came to a head. A monumental assembly had gathered from across the galaxy, each species bringing its own culture, politics, and biases to the table. The debate was heated, the atmosphere thick with anticipation. At the heart of this assembly stood Ambassador Marcus Holt, a human, dressed in a simple yet unmistakable black suit that was still rumpled from his travels. He had arrived just days earlier, his species still fresh in the minds of the council members. They were used to delegations from species that were as old as the stars themselves, with centuries of wisdom and power. Humans, by comparison, were a novelty. A species that had barely mastered space travel, yet now they were requesting entry into the galactic fold. Some of the more established species believed this was a joke. Others saw it as an annoyance. But none of them truly took the humans seriously. The Mirian delegation, the most formidable military force in the galaxy, led the charge against human involvement. Drax, the Mirian representative, was a towering figure of green scales and fierce eyes. His deep voice echoed through the hall, every word dripping with disdain. "The Concordance has proposed a simple solution," Drax began. "Humanity will submit to our military oversight. In return, your species will benefit from our security and stability, an arrangement that will ensure your continued survival." Laughter filled the room. The idea that humans, fragile, young, and untested, could contribute to the vast machinery of galactic peace was laughable. Holt felt the sneers of the alien delegates burn into him as he stood there, unmoving. He knew this was coming. He had been briefed, prepared for the ridicule, but it still stung. With a slow, deliberate motion, Holt raised his hand. A flicker of recognition passed through the room as a hologram flickered to life above him, casting shadows and light across his face. The images were jarring, ancient Earth battles, a world torn by wars for resources, ideology, and survival. Pictures of soldiers in the mud, ships in space, and entire cities consumed by fire. The images flashed quickly, each one showing the horrors of Earth's past. "This is our history," Holt's voice rang out, calm but carrying an edge of steel. 2,000 years of war, not because we are bloodthirsty, but because we couldn't find a way to stop. We didn't stop because we wanted peace. We stopped because we ran out of enemies. For a moment, the room fell silent. Drax's sneer faltered, replaced by a cold, calculating expression. Holt continued, his voice cutting through the stillness. "You think we're ignorant, that we want to engage in more warfare. But the truth is, we know war better than anyone. We fought our own species into near extinction. What we want now is not to conquer, but to ensure that no one else suffers the way we have." The murmur of the crowd began to shift. Doubt crept into the minds of the delegates. Holt's words hung in the air like a dark omen. The humans' calm demeanor, the sheer weight of their history, seemed to unsettle even the most seasoned of diplomats. Drax opened his mouth to retort, but the words caught in his throat. He had thought the humans would cower under the weight of galactic might, but instead, he was faced with something far more dangerous. Humans who had seen the worst the universe could offer, and still stood tall. "I'm not threatening you," Holt said, his voice quiet but deadly serious. "I'm telling you the truth. Push us, and you will learn firsthand what it means to deal with a species that has nothing left to lose." The room held its breath. It was a challenge, subtle yet unmistakable. In that moment, Holt was not just a representative of humanity. He was the embodiment of a species that had fought, survived, and adapted. A species that was now poised to prove that their strength lay not in the weapons they wielded, but in the resilience of their will. Drax narrowed his eyes, his pride stung by the human's words. "The Concordance has never lost a war," he sneered, his tone dismissive. "We will see how long your resolve lasts, Ambassador." Holt's lips curved into a small, dangerous smile. "Neither have we." The silence in the room deepened, punctuated only by the sound of footsteps as delegates filed out. Some exchanged uneasy glances, others whispered amongst themselves. A sense of unease rippled through the assembly. The humans had made their mark, and for the first time in centuries, the galaxy realized that a new force was on the rise. Holt turned and walked from the chamber, his mind already focused on the next challenge ahead. He knew the path would not be easy. The galaxy was a vast and dangerous place, and the humans were still young, still untested. But they had something no other species possessed: the drive to adapt, to survive, and to fight when necessary. In the halls of the Galactic Military Academy, they would see exactly what humanity was made of. The galaxy would soon learn that it was not the strength of the weapon that mattered, it was the strength of the warrior wielding it. And humanity was about to show them just how strong they could be. The first trial, the first day of training at the Galactic Military Academy, was one of intense anticipation. Within the sprawling, gleaming walls of the academy, countless species from across the galaxy had trained for centuries. The air was thick with the sounds of soldiers sharpening their skills and the scent of high-tech weaponry and alien metals. The academy was legendary, not just for its rigorous training, but for the harsh trials that awaited its candidates. Only the strongest, most capable warriors would emerge as members of the elite forces that served the Galactic Concordance. Marcus Holt had never seen anything like it. Standing in the central courtyard, surrounded by the cadets of hundreds of alien species, he felt a strange mix of excitement and isolation. His human body, still unaccustomed to the gravity and atmosphere of the facility, felt heavy, and yet he didn't allow himself to show any sign of discomfort. He had faced worse. Earth's wars had trained him for moments like this. Moments where survival wasn't a given, and where every decision could be the difference between life and death. His first trial was one of the most brutal tests of the Academy, a combat simulation set in a virtual world designed to challenge even the most resilient warriors. The room where he stood now was dimly lit, filled with the hum of advanced machinery. A massive virtual arena loomed in front of him, one where cadets were expected to face off against simulated threats of various alien species, some of which could move faster than thought, while others possessed abilities that defied the very laws of nature. There was no room for error. Commander Razak Blinn, a veteran of countless galactic wars, stood nearby, observing with a critical eye. His expression was one of skeptical amusement as he watched the human prepare. He had seen hundreds of candidates from the most powerful species in the galaxy fail under pressure, and he had little reason to believe that this fragile human would be any different. "You think you can handle this, human?" Blinn asked, his voice as cold as the depths of space. Marcus nodded without hesitation. "I've been through worse," he replied, his voice calm yet determined. Blinn snorted, watching as Marcus stepped into the simulation chamber. He activated the system, and the lights flickered briefly as the environment shifted. Within moments, Marcus was standing in the middle of a war-torn city, the sky above him a sickly red hue, thick with smoke and debris. The ground was littered with the remnants of destroyed buildings, and the sound of distant gunfire echoed through the air. He took a deep breath, focusing all his attention on the task at hand. As the simulation began, Marcus was immediately met with a flurry of movement. The first enemies appeared, a group of Draconians, their massive, armored forms towering over him. Their plasma breath could melt steel in an instant, but Marcus didn't flinch. He had trained for this moment. The Draconians charged, their bodies moving with terrifying speed, their claws crackling with energy. Marcus's heart raced, but his mind was as sharp as ever. He ducked low, using his agility to his advantage. He darted to the side just as the first Draconian swung its claw, the razor-sharp edge missing him by inches. He was already on the move, flipping a small device from his belt, sending a pulse of energy that temporarily stunned the creature. With the Draconian temporarily immobilized, Marcus moved in quickly, delivering a precise strike that disabled its armor. From the corner of his eye, he saw more enemies approaching, this time a group of Epsilon minds, telepathic beings whose reality-bending powers were notorious. Their eerie, glowing forms shimmered in and out of existence, their movements impossible to predict. They phased through walls and reappeared behind Marcus, their psychic tendrils attempting to seize his mind. But Marcus was ready. He'd been trained in adaptive warfare, how to counter enemies who bent the laws of physics. His eyes narrowed as he focused, blocking out all distractions. He threw himself to the ground just as one of the Epsilon minds appeared above him, its energy tendrils snapping through the air. He rolled, his hand reaching for his sidearm. With a swift motion, he fired a charged shot, momentarily disrupting the creature's psychic field. The Epsilon mind screeched, its form flickering out of existence before it reappeared several meters away. Marcus didn't hesitate. He knew this was his moment to finish the fight. He sprinted toward the creature, closing the distance faster than they could react. In one fluid motion, he thrust a blade into its center, disabling the creature before it had a chance to react. His breath was heavy, but his movements were precise, each one a testament to the discipline he had honed on Earth's battlefields. As the simulation came to an end, the entire arena fell silent. The holographic enemies vanished, and Marcus stood alone, his chest heaving from the exertion. The room's lights flickered back on, and the virtual world faded into the background. He didn't have to look around to know that every pair of eyes in the room was on him. He had done the impossible. He had taken on the galaxy's most fearsome warriors and emerged victorious. But to the others, it was more than just a victory. It was a statement. Commander Blinn, who had watched the entire simulation from the control booth, stared at the human in disbelief. "Impossible," he muttered to himself. How did he do that? He wasn't the only one shocked. The other cadets, the elite of the elite, stood frozen in place. Some had expected Marcus to fail spectacularly. Others had written him off as just another deluded human trying to prove something. But none of them had expected him to succeed. Not like this. "What kind of training did you receive?" Blinn demanded, his voice strained. Marcus met the commander's gaze with a calm, unwavering look. "On Earth, survival is a skill we don't take for granted. I learned from the best. I fought in wars where the stakes were life and death every single day. Nothing about this simulation was harder than that." Blinn's expression softened for a moment, though he quickly masked it with an air of professionalism. He wasn't about to give this human too much credit. Not yet. "We'll see if you can maintain that level of performance when the real trials begin." But Marcus wasn't worried. He knew this was just the beginning. The real trials, the ones that would test his physical and mental limits, were yet to come, and he was ready for them. Whatever the galaxy threw his way, he would adapt. He would survive. And in the end, he would prove that humanity's greatest strength wasn't their technology or their weapons. It was their sheer will to endure, to fight, and to never give up. The galaxy had just learned the first, unforgettable lesson: never underestimate a human. Breaking the limit. Marcus Holt had come to the Galactic Military Academy to prove a point, to himself and to the galaxy. What he didn't expect was how quickly he'd be thrust into an environment that tested his every limit. The first trial had been grueling, but now, as the Academy's training program shifted into more brutal and physically demanding exercises, Marcus found himself faced with challenges far beyond the virtual world. The next phase of his training was called the Gauntlet. It was a live combat exercise designed to simulate a variety of real-world scenarios, from planetary invasions to skirmishes against hyper-intelligent, hostile species. To most cadets, it was the ultimate test. To Marcus, it was another day on Earth's battlefields, where every breath could be your last. Standing in the center of the massive arena, Marcus surveyed the environment. The gauntlet wasn't just one simulation, it was a constantly shifting test. Each cadet would be placed in an ever-changing environment, one that evolved with each passing moment, throwing new dangers at them with no chance for rest. As Marcus took his first few steps, the environment began to transform before his eyes. The once open field morphed into a dense jungle, the air thick with the smell of alien flora and the hum of strange insect-like creatures flying above him. Around him, other cadets prepared. The Draconians flexed their plasma claws, while the Obsidian Collective, beings made entirely of black metallic silicon, seemed to vibrate with energy. They had no need to breathe and no visible eyes, but they seemed to be aware of everything happening around them. Yet despite the fearsome competitors, Marcus stood tall. His eyes narrowed, his mind calculating each possibility. Survival wasn't about brute strength. It was about outlasting everyone else. The simulation began with a burst of artificial noise, simulated explosions, sounds of warfare in the distance. Within seconds, a group of hostile alien creatures appeared on the horizon, towering and armed with deadly energy weapons. The other cadets immediately dove into action, using their superior speed, strength, and elemental abilities to take on the incoming threat. Marcus didn't rush. He was outnumbered, but he wasn't foolish. The key to surviving the gauntlet was not to be the strongest, but to be the smartest. As the first wave of attackers neared, Marcus scanned the environment. A group of Zethrins, reptilian predators known for their speed and razor-sharp claws, charged at him. Their agility was unmatched by most species in the Academy, but Marcus knew their weakness. Zethrins, though fast and vicious, relied on their senses, tracking their prey through sound and scent. He needed to be silent. As the Zethrins closed in, Marcus ducked behind a nearby rock formation, his body blending into the shadows. The Zethrins circled the area, their low growls vibrating the ground. They searched for him, but Marcus had already calculated his next move. With lightning speed, he slid out from his cover, using a piece of equipment from his belt, a cloaking device designed to temporarily distort his signature. The Zethrins lost track of him for a brief moment. In that second of confusion, Marcus struck. He threw a sharp, compact grenade that emitted a burst of electromagnetic energy, disabling the Zethrins' sensory abilities long enough for him to disable the creatures with precise, non-lethal force. It wasn't about killing them. It was about survival. And this wasn't a battle to the death. As the first wave fell, Marcus didn't allow himself to rest. The environment was shifting again, and the sounds of battle grew louder. A massive storm suddenly began to swirl around him, lightning crackling in the air, and the temperature plummeted. The gauntlet had shifted into a harsh, frozen tundra. The other cadets struggled against the bitter cold, their alien biology unable to adapt to the extreme conditions. But Marcus didn't struggle. He had trained in Earth's harshest environments, from deserts to the freezing Arctic, and the cold didn't faze him. He activated a small device in his suit that provided thermal regulation, giving him the edge in this phase of the simulation. Ahead, he spotted the next challenge. An armored juggernaut, a towering beast with impenetrable armor and an energy shield that could block anything short of a direct plasma hit. The other cadets, unable to deal with the juggernaut's power, were trying to outmaneuver it, but Marcus knew that wasn't going to work. Strength alone wouldn't defeat this enemy. He had to outthink it. He studied the juggernaut's movements, noticing the small gaps in its armor, just under its shoulders. With a steady hand, he pulled out a precision dart gun and fired a specialized round, one designed to release a concentrated EMP pulse. The dart flew through the air, hitting the juggernaut square in the shoulder. The EMP pulse disabled its energy shield, allowing Marcus to close the distance. With a swift, well-aimed strike, Marcus used his combat knife to exploit the weak point in the juggernaut's armor, disabling it in seconds. The other cadets watched in stunned silence as Marcus took down the beast that had overwhelmed them. One by one, other threats arose. Hostile drones, invisible predators, and deadly environmental hazards. But Marcus was always one step ahead. He adapted, using his earth-trained instincts to turn each obstacle into an opportunity. His agility, his adaptability, and his determination to survive were unmatched. By the end of the gauntlet, Marcus was the last cadet standing. When the simulation ended, the environment returned to normal, and the Academy's trainers deactivated the combat systems. Marcus, covered in sweat and dirt, but with a quiet satisfaction in his eyes, looked around at the other cadets. The surprise on their faces was palpable, and even Commander Blinn, who had been watching from the control room, stood in stunned silence. "How?" Blinn finally asked, his voice filled with disbelief. "How did you survive all of that?" Marcus's response was simple, yet profound. "I didn't survive because I was the strongest. I survived because I never gave up. The universe may be full of powerful creatures, but no one can match the will to fight that comes from within. And that's something humans understand better than anyone." The rest of the cadets couldn't deny the truth in his words. Marcus had broken every expectation, and with each trial, he proved that humanity's true strength didn't lie in raw power, but in their ability to adapt, survive, and never back down. As the Academy's trainers processed the results, Marcus knew one thing for certain. His journey had only just begun. The galaxy had underestimated humanity, but by the time Marcus was finished, no one would ever make that mistake again. The Awakening. The Galactic Elite had witnessed Marcus Holt's prowess in the trials, and yet it wasn't until the next stage that they truly understood what they were dealing with. The Academy's next phase, known as the Crucible, was a far cry from the simulations and tests. It was designed to push the boundaries of mental and physical endurance to their limits, forging warriors from raw material into something sharper, more deadly. But for Marcus, this stage was a challenge of a different kind. It would test the very core of his identity. The environment of the Crucible was nothing like the simulated combat zones he had faced before. This time, there were no digital enemies or virtual landscapes. The trials were as much about internal struggle as they were about external conflict. The arena was a vast expanse of broken terrain, littered with remnants of past conflicts and abandoned technology. The air was thin, the gravity fluctuated, and the landscape itself seemed to shift under his feet, making every step unpredictable. Each candidate was given a different scenario tailored to their weaknesses, a test designed not just to challenge their skills, but to break them. Some would face extreme isolation, while others would be forced to confront their deepest fears. But Marcus wasn't prepared for what awaited him. As the gates to the Crucible slammed shut behind him, the environment changed once more, this time with a wave of sheer disorientation. The ground beneath his boots began to pulse, as though the very earth itself was alive, shifting constantly, pulling him in directions that didn't make sense. He could hear whispers in the wind, voices that spoke in languages he couldn't understand, yet their tone carried a sense of urgency, of warning. He pressed forward, heart racing, eyes scanning the horizon. Something was off. There was no enemy in sight, but that was the problem. The trial was not about combat. It was about survival in the face of unknown threats. Suddenly, the whispers grew louder, swirling around him like a storm, and before he could react, the landscape shifted entirely. The ground cracked open, sending him tumbling into a dark chasm, his surroundings plunging into absolute blackness. His heart pounded in his chest as he scrambled to find his bearings. In the darkness, his mind began to race. This wasn't just a physical trial, it was a psychological one. The shadows in the chasm seemed to move, following his every step. He heard the sounds of footsteps, soft and deliberate, as though someone, or something, was tracking him. He wasn't alone. But Marcus had been trained for this. His military background had taught him how to handle extreme stress and disorientation. He closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath, and focused on calming his thoughts. This wasn't real. This was just a test. Slowly, he began to adapt to the oppressive darkness. His training on Earth, surviving against overwhelming odds in hostile environments, kicked in. He remembered the way Earth's special forces operated, always moving, always thinking, and always adapting. Then he saw something, eyes, glowing in the dark, dozens of them, blinking at him from the shadows. They were watching him, waiting for the right moment to strike. Marcus tensed, but his body was still. His eyes darted from one pair of glowing eyes to another. Not yet. Wait for the right moment. A noise broke the silence, soft, eerie, but distinct. The eyes were closing in, drawing closer. He reached into his pack, his fingers brushing against the cool metal of his equipment. His hand grasped the last thing he would need, an energy blade, small but effective in close combat. Without a second thought, Marcus activated the weapon. The blade hummed to life, casting a faint glow that illuminated the cavernous space just enough for him to make out the creatures around him. They were native to the planet, their bodies shadowy and serpentine, shifting in and out of the darkness. One of them lunged, and Marcus was already in motion. He sidestepped, using the creature's momentum against it, slashing at its underbelly. The energy blade cut clean through, sending a spray of energy that illuminated the chasm for a brief moment. The creature's body evaporated into wisps of shadow, but more eyes were still out there, and they weren't backing down. Marcus tightened his grip on the blade, his senses heightened. He had no idea how many more creatures were lurking in the dark, but he couldn't afford to hesitate. The whispers began again, louder this time, speaking directly to him, visions flashing in his mind. The creatures weren't just beasts. They were manifestations of his fears, his doubts, and the challenges of the Academy. They were testing his resolve. "Give up," one of the whispers taunted. "You're not meant for this. You're just a human." Marcus didn't stop. Instead, he pressed on, slashing through the shadows. "You're wrong," he muttered to himself, pushing forward with renewed determination. "I am meant for this." The shadows lashed out, but with each swing of his blade, Marcus dismantled them. They were nothing but projections of his own weaknesses, reflections of the very insecurities he had buried deep within himself. He realized then that the true trial wasn't defeating the creatures. It was overcoming the internal battle that threatened to break him. The voices, the darkness, the isolation. It was all designed to make him question his place here, to make him doubt whether he had what it took to survive. But Marcus Holt was not one to back down. He had faced humanity's darkest moments, wars, loss, destruction, and had survived them all. He had adapted and grown stronger. And in this moment, he understood that the only way out of this trial was to face his own fears head-on. With every slash of his blade, he fought back against the self-doubt and insecurities that had once held him back. Finally, the darkness began to recede. The whispers died away, replaced by an eerie silence. The creatures disappeared, vanishing into thin air. The ground beneath Marcus's feet solidified, and the cold, oppressive atmosphere lifted. He stood alone, breathing heavily, his clothes tattered and his body covered in sweat and cuts. The trial was over. As Marcus stood there, catching his breath, he realized that the crucible had done more than test his survival skills. It had forced him to face the very essence of what it meant to be human. It was not about being the strongest, or the fastest, or the most powerful. It was about the courage to confront your own weaknesses and keep moving forward, no matter the odds. The other cadets who had completed their trials had gathered at the far side of the arena, watching him closely. They had seen his performance in the earlier tests, but this was different. This was the moment when they understood. Marcus wasn't just a human. He was something more. He was the embodiment of a force the galaxy hadn't yet fully comprehended. As the Academy's doors opened, revealing the light of the outside world, Marcus stepped forward with quiet confidence. The galaxy had tested him, but in the end, it had only made him stronger. The true battle had only just begun, the rise of the underdog. The Galactic Military Academy's reputation, was built on centuries of producing the galaxy's finest warriors. From the quantum minds of Epsilon to the fearsome Draconians, the cadets who passed through these halls were nothing short of legends. Yet as Marcus Holt stood at the threshold of the final phase of the trials, he could sense the mounting tension, not from the weight of the challenges ahead, but from the eyes of those who had once dismissed him. The galaxy's elite were now watching him, not with ridicule, but with growing unease. Marcus had already proven himself in ways that no one could have anticipated. His raw combat skills, adaptability, and relentless drive had shattered every expectation. But now, the stakes were higher. The trials of ascendance would test the very essence of what it meant to be a warrior, a leader, and most importantly, someone who could make a difference in a universe that had long underestimated humanity. Unlike the previous stages, the trials of ascendance weren't just about fighting. They were about leadership, strategy, and decision-making under pressure. The cadets would be placed in high-stakes scenarios where every decision could mean life or death, not just for them, but for entire battalions of soldiers from various species. This was not simply a test of strength. It was a test of judgment, of moral clarity, and of the ability to inspire those around you. Marcus knew this would be his true challenge. In previous trials, he had relied on his ability to outthink and outblast his enemies. Now he would need to prove that he could lead others, not just humans, but the galaxy's most powerful beings. The simulation began with an eerie quiet. Marcus, along with several other cadets, found themselves aboard a massive warship, drifting through the vastness of space. The ship's hull vibrated with the hum of its engines, but a sense of dread lingered in the air. The mission briefing had been simple, a peacekeeping operation to a contested border system, where tensions between two hostile alien factions had reached their boiling point. The situation was delicate, and the potential for an all-out war was high. The other cadets immediately took charge, their species' natural abilities and instincts making them formidable in their own right. The Epsilon twins, Zara and Zora, had already begun using their psychic powers to scan the area, looking for threats before they even appeared. The Draconians, ever brimming with confidence, began strategizing how they would tear through enemy lines with their raw power. Meanwhile, the Obsidian Collective, cold, calculating, and always logical, waited patiently, evaluating every possibility with their superior intellects. But Marcus wasn't rushing. The human way of doing things had never been about charging headfirst into a battle. It was about understanding the situation, the people involved, and most importantly, the stakes. He studied the data screens in front of him, watching as the sensor readings indicated a shift in the enemy's fleet movement. The factions were preparing for war, but they didn't realize that a larger, even more dangerous force was lurking just beyond the system's border, an ancient nomadic species known only as the Kalor, a race of beings that had once nearly decimated entire civilizations before mysteriously disappearing into the deep void of space. The other cadets were so focused on their individual strengths, ready to clash with the alien factions, that they failed to notice the greater threat. The Kalor didn't fight with brute strength. They fought with subtlety, infiltrating enemy lines before revealing their true power. Marcus understood this all too well. The Kalor had used these same tactics in the past, and their history was written in the ashes of civilizations that had underestimated them. Commander Holt, Lieutenant Farah's voice interrupted his thoughts. The bioluminescent patterns of her skin flickered, her expression one of urgent concern. The enemy fleet has locked onto us. We're running out of time. Marcus knew this was his moment. The Epsilon twins were already preparing to launch a psychic assault on the enemy ship, while the Draconians were discussing how to engage in a direct firefight. The Obsidian Collective remained stoic, calculating their odds. But none of them were seeing the bigger picture. The Kalor would never engage them head-on. They would strike from the shadows, picking them off one by one. "Hold the fire," Marcus said calmly, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had earned the right to lead. "We're not dealing with what we think we're dealing with. We need to outsmart them before we fight them." The other cadets turned to look at him, their skepticism evident. Commander Blinn, watching from the observation deck, narrowed his eyes. He had seen Marcus' performance in the previous trials, but this was different. This was a battlefield, and Marcus was just one human among many powerful species. Could he really lead them to victory? "Sir, you're not suggesting we back down?" Zara, the Epsilon twin, asked with a raised eyebrow. "We have the power to defeat them now." "No," Marcus replied, shaking his head. "We'll only play into their hands if we do that. They want us to engage. To waste our resources on a battle we'll never win. We need to create a diversion, draw them out into the open where we can see them." The cadets exchanged glances, uncertain but intrigued. Marcus had already proven himself in combat, but this was different. This was a test of something else, of leadership, of courage in the face of the unknown. "Commander, what do you suggest?" Lieutenant Farah asked. Marcus turned to the crew. "We'll pretend to be vulnerable. Draw their fleet in with false signals. Make them think we're an easy target. Then, when they come within range, we'll trap them. We'll use their own strategy against them." It was a bold move, but Marcus knew it was their only chance. They had to think beyond the obvious, beyond brute force. He tapped into the knowledge of Earth's greatest military minds, drawing from the strategies of warfare that relied not on overpowering an enemy, but on manipulating their perceptions and weaknesses. It was time for them to show the galaxy that humanity didn't need to fight with sheer strength. They fought with something even more powerful: strategy and cunning. As the simulation unfolded, Marcus' plan took shape. The cadets followed his lead, their initial hesitation slowly turning into trust. One by one, the alien factions fell into the trap he had set. The Kalor, unsuspecting and overconfident, began their descent into the trap Marcus had prepared for them. The enemy fleet, once a looming threat, was now trapped in a well-executed ambush. The cadets, using the advantage of surprise, disabled the Kalor ships with precision strikes. What had started as a battle for survival had become a demonstration of human ingenuity and leadership. Marcus Holt, the underdog, had not only survived the trials of ascendance, he had reshaped the way the galaxy saw humanity. As the last enemy ship fell silent, the crew of the warship stood in stunned silence. The cadets had won, not because of their strength, but because they had trusted Marcus' vision, his ability to lead with intellect, not just muscle. Commander Blinn, his face unreadable, finally spoke. "Well done, Ambassador Holt. You've earned your place here. And perhaps you've shown us all what it truly means to be an elite warrior." Marcus stood tall, knowing that his journey had only just begun. He had come to the academy as a mere human, but now he stood among the stars, a leader among the elite. The galaxy would never be the same. The final countdown. The atmosphere at the Galactic Military Academy had shifted. Gone were the doubts, the sneers, and the condescension that had once followed Marcus Holt like a shadow. Now the halls buzzed with a sense of respect, respect earned through the most unlikely of victories. The cadets who had once mocked him now looked at him with a mixture of admiration and awe. The galaxy's elite had been forced to confront the truth. Humanity was no longer just a species to be tolerated. They were a force to be reckoned with. But Marcus wasn't celebrating. Not yet. The final trial, the reckoning, awaited him. It was the ultimate test, the culmination of everything he had endured, and it would determine whether he truly belonged among the galaxy's finest warriors, or whether his success had simply been a fluke. The trial was different from anything Marcus had faced before. The simulation, while brutal, had been a controlled environment. The gauntlet, while physically demanding, was still a test of individual skill. The reckoning, however, was a live operation. Real enemies, real stakes. And for Marcus, it was more than just another test. It was a chance to prove to the galaxy that humanity was more than just survivalists. They were leaders, capable of bringing order to chaos. The briefing room was silent as the holographic map of the galaxy flickered to life before him. The atmosphere in the room was tense. more so than any previous briefing Marcus had attended. This wasn't just a simulation. This was a full-scale military engagement, one that could determine the future of the entire sector. The situation is critical. Admiral Krell, the towering draconian officer with cybernetic eyes, began. His deep voice reverberated in the room. A rogue faction of the Clore has infiltrated the Vothan system. They've taken control of a key communications relay station, and they're preparing to launch a series of destabilizing attacks on several member worlds. If they're not stopped, the entire sector could fall into chaos. The Clore, the ancient nomadic race, had returned from the shadows. They were a species with the ability to manipulate space-time, moving through the galaxy undetected, striking where and when least expected. Marcus had faced their tactics before in the simulation, but this time it was different. The stakes were real. Their power was real. The objective, Admiral Krell continued, is to retake the station and neutralize the Clore threat before they can launch their attacks. You'll be leading a mixed battalion of cadets from various species. Time is critical. We have less than 24 hours before the relay station becomes operational, and if they succeed, their message will ignite a chain reaction of conflict across the galaxy. Marcus felt the weight of the responsibility settling on his shoulders. He wasn't just leading his fellow humans. He was leading an army of the galaxy's elite. The Draconians, with their unmatched strength, the Obsidian Collective, whose minds were capable of manipulating data in real time, the Epsilon Twins, who could phase through solid objects with ease. Every one of them had powers and abilities beyond anything Marcus had ever seen, and yet he was their commander. The mission was simple in theory: infiltrate the station, disable its weapons systems, and neutralize the Clore operatives. But Marcus knew that nothing was ever simple in war. The Clore were unpredictable. Their ability to manipulate the fabric of space meant that they could appear out of nowhere, shifting positions faster than any species could react. As the battalion assembled, Marcus stood before them, his eyes scanning each member of the team. They were all waiting for him to give the order, to show them that he was worthy of the trust they had placed in him. This was no longer about proving himself to anyone. It was about leading them all to victory. "Listen up," Marcus began, his voice steady but authoritative. "We're up against a force we don't fully understand. The Clore are masters of deception. We cannot afford to make mistakes. We will move fast, but we will move smart. Our mission is not just to defeat them, it's to outthink them." The cadets listened intently. The gravity of the situation was beginning to sink in, and the unity among them grew. They were no longer just a group of different species. They were a team. And they were going to follow Marcus into battle because they believed in his ability to lead them to victory. The countdown had begun. In mere hours, they would breach the Clore-controlled relay station. The tension in the air was palpable. Marcus could feel the weight of the responsibility pressing on him, but he couldn't afford to show any sign of hesitation. The galaxy was watching. As the fleet prepared to launch, Marcus and his team boarded the assault ships, ready for what lay ahead. The cold vacuum of space stretched out before them, and the distant lights of the relay station loomed like a silent sentinel. Marcus stared at it, his mind working overtime. What did the Clore want? Why had they chosen this station? The answer, he realized, was simple: control. The Clore didn't just want to destabilize the galaxy, they'd wanted to rule it. And they knew that chaos was the quickest path to power. Marcus had to stop them before their influence spread any further. The assault ships slipped into the shadow of the station, unseen by the Clore. They were taking a stealth approach, using every advantage they had to remain undetected. But Marcus knew it was only a matter of time before the Clore realized they were there. And when that happened, every second would count. "On my signal," Marcus said into his comms, "we move in, and we move fast. Stay sharp. Expect the unexpected." The station loomed closer, the countdown ticking down. Marcus's mind raced through every possible scenario, every contingency plan he had prepared. But deep down, he knew one thing for certain. This was their moment. This was the test that would define not just his career, but humanity's place in the galaxy. As the ships docked with the station, Marcus and his battalion stepped into the unknown, ready to face the claw and show the galaxy what humanity was capable of. The final trial had begun, and Marcus Holt was determined to finish it on his terms. The galaxy had underestimated him, but by the end of this mission, it would know exactly what humans were capable of: unpredictable, unyielding, and unstoppable.